they interact with the waiter? How do they interact with the Uber driver? How do they interact with other people, but particularly when they have some power?
Welcome to Lovelink, guys, your guide to relationships in all forms. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different than we typically do. We're going to be answering our audience's, your questions about romantic relationships. And today, we have the Modern Mind team here with us. So welcome, Tess and Yaron.
Thank you.
Hello. Glad to have you here.
So happy to be back.
Yeah.
And this is really going to be a series of roundtables. So the first one, we're going to be answering your questions on romantic relationships. And in the future, we're going to be answering your questions on different topics. So if you have any topics that you really want us to focus on, you can either email us at info@modernmind.co or Instagram us at modernmindpractice, and we will continue to answer your questions. So let's start with the first question. What is the biggest mistake you can make in a relationship?
Such a good, big first question. The thing that comes to mind for me, just as a first pass on an answer to this question, because I think there are a lot of different answers, would be to not focus on yourself. So a big mistake people make is blaming their partner, getting critical of their partner, and not examining their contribution to a negative dynamic, and not taking the time to unpack what past trauma or past experience is leading to their protective parts coming up in the relationship now. So not doing their own personal work on that is a big one, I think.
Huge.
Yeah, I really like that as well. I was thinking more just about the big mistake that you might make as you enter into a relationship. I was thinking in terms of my previous career, which was in movies, and I think a lot of it depends on casting. I think casting the right person in the role gives you a better chance of success. So I think a lot of times we walk into relationships with hopes and wishes, and the person that we're potentially getting into a relationship with might almost be there or might kind of fit the bill, but doesn't quite, and a lot of times we do the rest of the work with our imagination and our desire, and oftentimes that can backfire or that can go awry. So I think it's important if I was to distill that, it's important to see the other person as clearly as possible, aside from what you hope or wish they are, right at the very beginning, which then obviously also leads to this other notion that it's good to know who you are right from the start as much as possible, and what you need and what your non-negotiables are to the degree that they are. And sometimes it feels maybe a little dry, maybe a little mechanical, but I think keeping those things in mind might save you a lot of heartache later on.
I was thinking about it in a really similar way to you as well, with like going into these relationships, wanting someone to fit an image that we have, and how oftentimes we go in with all of these assumptions in relationships, whether that's how we want it to go or what we assume the other person is thinking or feeling in any situation. And that could be at the very beginning or like long-term into a relationship. And I always use this imagery of like a brick wall. Like each assumption that you put on this other person is like another brick that's being added to a wall. And the more assumptions we have, the higher that wall gets, and the harder it is to see the other person truly on the other side. Mm-hmm. So like really approaching it with that vulnerable curiosity, because all it really is like trying to get to know someone, and looking at it from that lens is always a way to be more open and really learning more, rather than going in and kind of having your assumptions dictate your behavior.
That's a beautiful imagery, that wall. I like that a lot.
Love my imagery.
Yeah, I'm also just thinking as an umbrella, kind of it integrates all of this a little bit, is this idea of avoidance. if you avoid doing your own work and really knowing what you're looking for, or avoid all of the defenses that we come with relationships, whether it's projection, right, like you and Tess and your own are talking about, or taking past relationship trauma, whether that's family or exes, and putting them onto the other person, like avoiding that interferes. But also avoidance as the relationship progresses in sharing what's coming up for you. Something that I see, especially we see it as therapists far down the line, is when partners hold on to things and don't talk about it. So whether that's frustrations or conflicts or wants or desires, and all of that builds up over time. And when it builds up, it's resentment, it's anger at the other, contempt, or it's feeling like you've lost yourself, like there's some sort of self-sacrifice going on. And I think it can be insidious. It can build up and creep up on you. So yeah, avoidance in the beginning in terms of yourself and looking and really seeing the other person, but also avoidance as the relationship progresses and really being open and sharing what's on your mind.
That also makes me think about how a lot of the time couples will come in and one person might be talking about how, the relationship is feeling bad, there's lots of conflict, and they're feeling really ambivalent about staying. And there's kind of this assumption like relationships are supposed to feel good all the time, or like they're not supposed to feel uncomfortable. And if they start to feel a little uncomfortable, then it's like, we're not compatible, this is not going to work, rather than, hey, why is it feeling uncomfortable? What is this about? Get curious about that. That feels like a big one, especially kind of at the, 3 to 7 year mark, where people are really past the honeymoon phase and they're kind of in real life with each other, and then all that shit is starting to come up and the dynamic is emerging in full force, and then that's when people start to want to step out.
There's that shift that happens, and when there's a shift after, like, I feel like any time longer than a year in a relationship, people kind of look at it and think, oh my gosh, have we changed too much? Do we not align anymore? And in reality, it's just a new opportunity to reconnect and start learning more about each other in a different way. And I feel like that's where we really see relationships start to grow and align in new ways and connect in new ways. And this new form of dating starts to emerge.
That's such a good point. Like, I think, a big mistake is thinking that after the honeymoon, which is all about symbiosis and twinning and being on the same page, which is very lovely to feel like you're one person, to assume that when you start to become two separate people, when you differentiate, that actually you're not compatible anymore. And to really reframe that as, listen, sometimes after a year you recognize there are significant incompatibilities and it's not going to work, but that also to be two separate people is really critical for relationship success. And to reframe that as, okay, now we're growing and we can grow in separate directions together. We can still stay connected, but have different perspectives, different interests, differences.
It's actually more interesting too. It's kind of a reframe, like, oh, you're differentiating, you're seeing the person, more clearly. There's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of curiosity that you can have about, what happens in that phase if you're willing to be curious, rather than feel threatened by it, we're different.
It's like that not like never stop dating notion when you get into a really long-term relationship, but that I think people often just picture that as meaning like go out on dates intentionally, do things fun, but it also means continue to explore each other and continue to get to know each other in new ways. And I think we often forget that especially after we're like cohabitating with someone.
Yeah, just to echo and reinforce what you were saying, Tess, and what you were saying as well, Simone, about when that to be open and I think accepting of what happens when a relationship has that altitude drop, where like after the first 6 months or the first year, the oxytocin is sort of like dissipate a little bit, and everyone is, you've gone back into you've gotten a rhythm, and it's a little humdrum, maybe it's a little mundane, and you kind of get to see each other in the Monday to Friday mode as opposed to the weekend mode, and then people really like there's this big kind of drop, and people oftentimes don't know what to do with the discomfort. They don't know what to do with the boredom. They don't know what to do with, the other person irritating you. And they often mistake that for, incompatibility. They often mistake it for, the relationship not working. And oftentimes it isn't. It's just like all of you have said, of entering another phase. So how do you open yourself up to that, accept that, and also reframe? Because nobody sort of promises you warm, fuzzy feelings for the rest of your life. But we're all kind of like built culturally and I think romantically to expect that that's just how the train's going to go the entire time. And we really don't have the resilience to deal with it when it doesn't. So, I think knowing that it's going to happen and knowing that those feelings aren't necessary, there's nothing necessarily the matter here. It's just another iteration, just another part of what's going on. Unless, of course, like you said, Simone, like there really are major incompatibility, fundamental core principle or orienting principle issues that you guys have basically, somebody was saying, I don't know who said it, but they said the first 6 months of the relationship, it's like we send our ambassadors to meet each other, and so we don't, it's not that we're being inauthentic, but we're sending the best representative of ourselves, and then what happens when the ambassadors recede and, the rest of the diplomatic mission shows up and it gets kind of messy and real. Yeah. So. Yeah.
The other thing, oh, no, go ahead.
No, I have another one, which is don't make assumptions. I think in the beginning, we make all these assumptions about the person, projections, idealize them. That's one thing. But then as the relationship progresses, you move in with each other, you cohabitate. There's this real assumption that we fully know a person, that they can't change. We assume what they're thinking. We assume their intentions behind certain acts. And I think this really gets into a lot of problems in relationships. And instead, I think approaching any kind of conflict or any kind of moment where you're really interested in learning and discovering what the other person is thinking or feeling is just such a better setup for success.
Totally.
Assuming the intentions is so major, like that intent versus impact moment when people come in, and that's like I see couples spend an entire hour just talking about that itself. Like one moment that lasted 30 seconds can be pulled apart to this moment where we're unpacking the intention versus the impact for so long because we have no idea what it actually means to the other person, what they did versus how I perceived it and how it landed on me versus what their goal was when they did that action.
Yeah. And that's, I often see that with couples that I work with that, the first thing that leaves a good working relationship is that, benefit of the doubt, the assumption of the intention, like whatever the other, if there's a good way or a bad way to take it, or even a neutral way, when things are going, badly, the assumption is always that it's pointed, that it's underhanded, that there's something malign behind it, and it goes both ways, and it just, it toxifies the air, and it's the thing, it's one of the things that, in the de-escalation process of the ETF, it's like one of the things that I work on, extensively is de-escalating that part and not assuming this malintent on the part of the partner, and actually having them spell it out a little bit, sort of as sometimes you feel like the couple has lost the manual for communication, and you kind of have to reopen the manual, and it reads a little bit like stereo instructions. The sentences have to get a little longer. Everything has to be spelt out a little more. It feels awkward, but it's almost like we just have to reassure each other that what I'm saying is a bid for connection and not an attempt to undermine whatever it is that you're trying to do. And yeah, that's a big part of that kind of the middle passage in relationships.
Relationships are hard work.
This is in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, yeah. Don't assume that you can just take your relationship for granted. Like it requires work and nurturing.
Every relationship is its own cooking recipe, you could imagine. And every single recipe has different measurements and different things that you need for it. So going into every relationship, assuming you're going to need the same set of ingredients, you're missing out on a huge new possibility of what could come out of the oven at the end.
Agreed. I think I have a question more than an answer. It doesn't is not part of any specific part of the 3 questions we have, but maybe it feeds into the red flags. But I wondered, knowing all of that, if there aren't like kind of core non-negotiables that are universal, maybe not universal, but that are things to look for. One of the things that springs to mind for me is temperament. Like if the person in the first 6 months to a year, you should be able to at least see the person's temperament. You don't know how they'll evolve. You don't know how circumstances will change the relationship, but you can see how that person reacts to any given situation and where you are and how far off that temperament. Some people like to be at 8. They're comfortable right up here screaming at each other for 5 minutes and then forgetting about it. Other people aren't. And so I wonder if there are things that right at the beginning, people can be on the lookout for and say, okay, well, this thing is important to me in a non-changeable way, and for me, for example, temperament is a big one, irrespective of circumstance. What
kind of temperament for you?
For me, it needs to be easy. It needs to be easy.
I'm with you.
I need someone that the thermostat doesn't go to 10. Yeah. It needs to be somebody that's calm and easy and can work through things to a degree. Of course, we all get frustrated. Of course, we all get stressed out. Things get loud. But in general, the default setting for me feels like I need someone easy, somebody who's that pops off too high, too fast. For me personally, it's very triggering.
Right, which might be okay for someone else. Someone else could tolerate that 8 out of 10.
Totally.
But for you, it might be that okay, I can't do more than a 5.
Yeah, 5 tops.
I share that too.
Yeah. And you get those moments like earlier than I think people expect to get them. Like you can see kind of how someone reacts to something that could happen on the street even, or like how they respond to a text from their friend if you're together while that happens. Like we do get little hints of these moments, and I think it's really easy to kind of push them aside, especially early in a relationship, because we're hoping like, oh, that's just in that specific kind of scenario, or it's never towards me, but it's early on. So you don't know how that dynamic is going to shift as you become someone that they're more comfortable with.
Hi, LoveLink listeners. Our group practice, Modern Mind, is located in New York City with offices in Brooklyn and Manhattan, offering in-person and virtual psychotherapy. We provide individual, couples, and group therapy, as well as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in conjunction with a psychiatry prescriber. Therapy is a powerful experience that can transform your life and help you live it to its full potential. We're here to help take you where you want to go. To find out more about our practice, visit www.modernmind.co or email info@modernmind.co to be connected with one of our therapists.
So that kind of leads in nicely to our second question, which is, what are red flags? Can you describe what it may look and feel like? And maybe we can talk about that in terms of different phases of the relationship, because I think there are different red flags kind of early on, like when you're just dating somebody, and then other red flags that come maybe later on once you're 2-3 years in, where it's more of an attachment relationship.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go back to what you were saying, Tess, and this is sort of a straddle between the two. I think just that this idea that in the first 6 months somebody's going to give you their blueprint, but you think, oh my God, that's adorable. The way you scream at that person shows passion and intensity, and I think, as opposed to thinking, oh, hold on a second, this could be a problem, because right at the beginning, you're just so ensorcelled by the other person, assuming that that's what's happening, that they could give you the blueprint. They could tell you, a lot of times people tell you exactly who they are and what they are. And, this is sort of a red flag mistake. It's a mistake not to listen to people when they tell you who they are. And in the beginning, we're just so on cloud 9 and we don't listen. And so I think it behooves everyone to listen. If someone's telling you like, this is how I am and I'm a this or that, I don't want to get into specifics, but like whatever it is, and it doesn't work for you, you should believe them.
Mm-hmm. And even in the honeymoon phase, those cycles are starting to percolate. You might not be able to recognize them as cycles, but 6 months later, a year later, you can look back at the first 6 months and it's all there. It's just the softened, muted, hidden version. So it is really important to pay attention in those early months. Okay, what is this person showing? Where do we disconnect? What sort of conflicts do we have? Because they will magnify. And sometimes they're manageable, and that's what you're just working with later on. And sometimes they're really helpful to use as indicators to say, oh, okay, actually, this is a red flag. This is maybe something that, right, this anger, I personally won't be able to tolerate or manage down the line.
Something else that comes up for me when thinking about red flags in really any phase, but you can start to really identify it early on. If you're setting any type of boundary with a person and they are crossing that boundary at any point, especially early on, then just like you said there, like take what they're doing as truth. They're showing you what they're capable of. And if you're setting a boundary, no matter how soft that boundary is, and they're passing it, that's information that you need to respect and hold on to, because that is a pattern that will grow and shift as you get more serious.
Do you have examples, Tess, of maybe small boundaries, small common boundaries? I'm coming with it in mind, but I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm seeing early on, something that I also comes up for me is texting early in relationships. Like I try to set a boundary of, as I get to know someone, I want to keep it like as low on texting as possible, or like types of communication, how certain people call or FaceTime or text throughout the day versus just texting to like make a plan, for example. If someone is really incessantly trying to get your attention throughout the day when you're kind of in your solo time, if you set that boundary and say, hey, I can really only talk after work or during this time of day or during this time of the week, and they're kind of pushing that boundary and getting upset with you about it, that's just a new conversation to walk into. But if after that second conversation it continues, that's where you start to really understand, okay, this might be a boundary that they're not really comfortable keeping. And that might just be based on a different set of needs that they have in a relationship, but it's all information. It's all data that's going into understanding how you would work together moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking also like sexual boundaries, saying you want to take it slow and the person not really respecting that, or I want to get back early, I have a work day tomorrow morning, and pushing to stay out late. Like any time where you feel like the person is trying to convince you out of what you've explicitly stated, even if it's small, that's something to notice.
Yeah. I'd also add like alcohol or substance use falling into that kind of early boundary setting. Like something that you should do if you have boundaries is set that super early, but also acknowledging if this is something that they're pushing against or pushing you to partake in.
I also think about how in the early stages, also important to notice how the person interacts when they're in a position of power. Like when they're at a restaurant, how do they interact with the waiter? How do they interact with the Uber driver if you're taking a cab or something? How do they interact with other people? But particularly when they have some power, that feels important. Like, are they respectful? And also how they talk about past relationships and family. Like, do they talk with a lot of blame or do they talk with nuance? I think about how if they're talking with a lot of blame and criticism, then you might be next once the relationship develops. So it's really something to think about. What is their relationship to their current and past attachment relationships?
And can they grow from those? Like if they're talking about them in a way that's thinking about, how did I take accountability or how did I evolve from that? That would be a green flag.
Yeah, I think just to speak to both what you were saying, Tess, and Tessina, so the idea of the texting and just early communication for me sort of goes under the umbrella of tempo. Like if your tempo and their tempo feels right and matched, and so it's not too hurried. You're not getting love bombed. You're not love bombing. You're not overly sharing. Everything feels like it's done within, just the tempo of the dance, of the way you communicate. And it feels natural. It doesn't feel like it takes a lot of muscle to get the other person to kind of be in line with you. You guys are in the same place. They're not too withdrawn, not too leaned in, just the Goldilocks, just right there in the zone, And obviously, like, maybe that feels idealized, but I think it's important, within parameters to notice that and to see that your tempos and your rhythms kind of align. And then just to what you were saying, Tina, I think relationships with parents, with family, with friends, if the person doesn't introduce you to anyone, if you never met any of their friends, if you don't know who their parents are, if they're kind of an isolated island. Now, that may, everybody has a different life story. So this isn't about judgment. It's just about seeing what works for you, but I think that their relationships, the way that they interact with their family and with their friends and seeing how they are, that will tell you as much as anything about who they are as anything that they say about themselves in the first 3 months,
Absolutely. And I think another piece too is how, and maybe this is in the really early stages, but how they text, the idea of breadcrumbing or this erratic texting, which I think is unfortunately very common. Like, you hear from a person multiple times during one day and then you don't hear from them in 3 days. Like, that kind of erratic communication is something that usually is an indicator of their capacity to communicate directly. And that's something to pay attention to.
I also think, like, sometimes it can be hard to know fully. Like, there can be these red flags, but maybe they're, like, it's not so clear, like, because how a person responds when they're feeling really anxious in the beginning of a relationship may not be how they are once their nervous system has calmed down. Like, for example, with texting, like, if somebody's like texting a lot because they're getting anxious about the connection, or they're like a little clingy or something, I don't know, then maybe that's a red flag. But it might also just be an indicator of some unmanaged anxiety in romantic relationships. And once that softens, it could look different. But it's worth obviously having a conversation with them about their behavior, and can they tolerate that?
Can we have orange flags?
Orange flags, yeah. But
yellow flags, cautionary flags.
Yeah. But if these things are coming up early, then I feel like that also takes you to this next one that I'm thinking about, which is, what's their capacity to talk about something directly? Like, if you bring up, I'm noticing that, some days you text me a lot and then I get radio silence from you. Is this you feeling anxious? What's going on for you? And I think oftentimes people are hesitant to have those conversations early on. But what is their capacity to meet you halfway in those conversations? Can this person explore it with you? Are they willing and able? And do you feel more connected after those conversations? Or do you feel like you've been kind of manipulated or gaslit? Or do you come out of those conversations feeling more confused than you went into them? So just like a lot of that checking in with yourself after conversations and seeing, am I feeling comfortable right now? Do I feel connected to myself as well as to this other person after I have kind of exploratory, vulnerable conversations?
Yeah, it's really a great test, or maybe experiment is a better word to use, around, in a non-attacking way, like bringing up something that's of an issue for you and seeing how they respond, because that in of itself is going to either show red flags, green flags, yellow flags. Like, it's going to bring a lot of data, rich data.
Mm-hmm. And those are the conversations that happen for the entirety of a relationship. So
that's it. That's the relationship.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Like, I remember when I was dating my husband, Chris, something that was a red flag for me was if I was on a date with somebody and they didn't ask me a lot of questions, then I was like, nah, I don't want to be with a person like that. I want them to be curious, like I'm curious. And we went on a couple of dates, and he wasn't, and I really liked him, but he wasn't asking me a ton of questions. But then when I told him, I was like, hey, you're not asking me a lot of questions. Like, I feel like I'm asking you all these questions, and we're talking a lot about you and me because I'm bringing myself in, but what's going on? And he's like, oh, I don't want to be intrusive. Like, in his upbringing, asking a lot of personal questions is intrusive. And I know that now from meeting his family. But just having that conversation changed everything. Because, I mean, now he asks a lot of questions, and after that, it was not an issue. But that thing of like holding back because he was afraid of pushing me away by being too intrusive.
Yeah, and I think that on in this particular cauldron that we live on, the Manhattan, Brooklyn, whatever nexus, there's a lot of noise in that first 3 to 6 months. It is hard to tease out the signal. There's a lot of people with a lot of, like, speaking to you, like this idea of erratic communication, like sort of like the crossover between the digital, the app world, where people like can literally go from talking to you to ghosting you, and there's no rhyme or reason. And there's a lot of that stuff happening, which in the early days might feel overly significant, but it's just because it's just a staticky environment that we live in, and so it is, I guess to your point, it's good to hold back and suspend some judgment and ask the questions and get to know before you kind of really, apportion what is a green flag and what is a red flag. Because in those first 3 to 4 months, first of all, multiple people are seeing multiple people. You have no idea what's going on, right? It's just, there's a lot of noise, I guess, and so it can be very confusing. And if you lean in too hard into those initial encounters and magnify those initial whatever they are, actions or reactions, right, you could misread the situation for sure.
I think that also connects to more long-term red flags too. If a person isn't able to listen, isn't able to take in some of the feedback, or isn't able to engage in a conversation about what's not working or things in the relationship that are coming up, that's a really hard one. That's a really hard one. If you can't grow, if they're not interested in your experience, you're going to be stuck.
It's reminding me of like conversations that we've all had together about couples coming into therapy and having very concrete issues that they want to solve. And it's
classic.
Kind of that shift of, okay, maybe this isn't about this concrete issue at all. We just need to be able to explore vulnerably and like dig really deep and see what's happening, layers underneath this concrete issue that we want so badly to just have an easy fix for. And it's that exploration that's everything for a relationship. That's so much more important. That ability to be flexible and to dive deeper together and hold space for the other person. And when we're able to do that, the concrete issues get so much easier to look at and so much easier to maneuver.
What are other red flags in long-term relationships and the second part of a relationship?
Sometimes I'm curious if you all have encountered this, a kind of chronic ambivalence. So somebody who's committed to their partner. I've had this with a couple of couples that I've seen, where one person is feeling ambivalent about their relationship, but they've kind of voiced that ambivalence for a long time. It's like an inability to commit. It's like they've committed, it's a monogamous relationship, but they're still not quite, they're always kind of not really sure if the other person is compatible with them. And I think that if that's a chronic issue, it's a red flag, because it creates so much distress in the other partner.
There's no emotional safety.
Right.
It's that 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Like, I'm here, I'm in it every day, but at the same time, I'm still letting you know, even though I'm here every day, I'm still not 100% sure that I'm going to stick around.
That's crazy making. That would personally drive me around the bend. That would be a very difficult thing to like deal with. I mean, like either yes or no, but yeah, I definitely recognize that as something, yeah, absolutely. But also, coming from the person who's chronically ambivalent is like they don't feel safe. They've got their own issues that they're dealing with, but obviously their needs are not being met by the partner in some significant ways. Oftentimes that's what I see. There are couples that come in where they're coming in specifically because like one person is just not able to articulate what they need in the sort of regular life setting, and so they come in so that we can sort of tease that out and reinforce that and help them articulate what's going on. It is maddening for the other person because the other person is constantly asking like, well, what do you want? What is the, and just to go back, oftentimes I see like in the early part of the relationship, there was one set of rules or kind of an operating system that worked, and then something changed. One of the partners changed and wants something different. Maybe they've grown emotionally. Maybe they want something, and the other person hasn't caught up and they don't know what they're doing wrong. So maybe that's a refinement of that kind of chronic ambivalence. Like it wasn't that they were always ambivalent. It was that like the first phase, the first 3 years of the relationship, it worked for them, and then something happened, or they grew, or they evolved in some way, and now the partner can't keep up, or doesn't know what's being asked of them, or isn't capable of giving them this new thing. We've come across that. And so, therapy is, I think, enormously helpful in at least being able to articulate the problem, because that is crazy making when one partner is like, well, everything that you asked of me, I'm doing. Everything that I thought it was all working, and now you're unhappy, but I don't know why, and you can't articulate. Right. And yeah.
Should we go to the last question?
I think we should go to the last one. Yeah. So the last one is, how do I head into a romantic relationship without losing myself?
This one, the first thing that popped into my mind when I was reading this was just get so clear on your needs, values, and desires before you go in. Or even if you're like kind of find yourself in the early stage of a relationship and you're realizing, wow, this is going somewhere. Do I know what my needs are in this? Do I know what my values are, both in a relationship and individually? Because those 3 factors are your roadmap to maneuvering this relationship and making sure that you don't end up kind of losing those parts of yourself, or deciding later on, wow, I had this need, or I had this value, and I found myself so far away from it years later. And that's where we find that we've lost parts of ourselves. So checking in and always knowing, okay, I have this need. I'm not going to waver on that because of a connection that I have, but rather voice that need and see how we can get closer to meeting both of our needs at the same time.
That's a really good point. I also think about the role that people often play when they want to help or caretake or do something for the other person, and really distinguishing when it's for that other person versus there's something in it that you're doing for yourself. Like, am I taking care of this person because it's helping me with my esteem, or it's helping me to feel good, or it's helping them to be more dependent on me? And that's a process that I think it's very easy to lose yourself. That's codependency. I'm doing this because I need something for this relationship to fill me up. And so really watching out for, when I'm kind of leaning into the relationship, is it really to grow? Is it really to help this other person? Or is there something underlying that in myself?
Yeah. My first reaction was, what's wrong with losing yourself? In a relationship, I think it also depends on what era of life you're in. I think you're in your 20s and you don't have there's not a lot of baggage. You just work and love. I mean, I don't know. I think there might be something. I mean, there's obviously something exciting about sort of intertwining and fusing with another human being in a way that we don't. That's it. This is the only type of relationship where this happens at this level of intensity. I'm not encouraging people to completely lose their minds, but like there's something really beautiful about that. I think that you can lose yourself in a relationship and then negotiate the boundaries depending on how young you are and how compatible you are. And again, I think that there's a way to kind of build the ship in the middle of the ocean when it comes to romantic love. And so again, I'm not suggesting it's a one size fit all, but I also think that, like, obviously there are clinical aspects to it. If you do become codependent, if you find yourself not being able to occupy a single moment of your time without the other person, and if they're gone, you find yourself completely lost or in a void. I mean, there's obviously extremes, but I think that, like, in the middle of the envelope, there's something really beautiful about losing yourself in another person. And there's a lot of time and room to negotiate your individuality inside the relationship, it seems to me. Maybe this is sort of like a slightly...
No, I love that. I think that's so helpful, just giving yourself permission to fall in love and be in a period where, you are you are on drugs. Like, that's part of it, and it's temporary. I think it's helpful for people to get educated around what it feels like to be in love and how long that lasts and what happens to your brain chemistry, because things do shift. And just not to diminish that feeling, but just to kind of know what to expect, so it doesn't feel so scary. Because I think if you know more about, this is what's happening to me right now, that's why I feel kind of crazy.
And to frame it right, there's a certain dose of healthiness in losing yourself, because it becomes a little bit of the glue. Like, we know in long-term relationships, you go back to that origin story and you think about how the two of you really kind of became one. And that's a really beautiful thing. Right. So there's that line between the healthy loss of self and then maybe veering into the unhealthy, where you lose your kind of core wants, needs, desires, you self-sacrifice, you lose touch with your friends or family, you isolate, you don't do the activities you used to like doing. That maybe is a little more on the unhealthy end of the spectrum. But I think it's a really great point, Yaron.
Right. And also just to, and again, I think this probably happens in a smaller amount of cases than not, just to not be so protective and so kind of defensive that we don't let ourselves, experience this thing, because we're looking for, that's sort of the proverbial, every man on a dating app is an axe murderer. You know what I mean? That kind of a thing, that where we just we're so aware, we're so protected, we're so cautious that, that we don't let the experience be what it is. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of room in the middle to have this incredible experience,
And if you're feeling afraid, I think reaching out to your friends and family just to ground yourself, maybe to get some feedback about what they're seeing, can sometimes be useful if you're feeling scared. Because usually that fear of losing yourself is also fear of being alone, being afraid, being in a bad situation and feeling really alone. So, staying connected during that time feels important.
Totally. Another way that I interpreted this question, even though I don't think this is what the writer intended, is some people lose themselves in terms of having too many voices in their head from the outside. They're dating someone and it's hard to actually trust their own intuition, and they rely too much on what other people say. And so they lose themselves in terms of, how do I feel with this person? And so staying connected to your body, staying connected to your own emotions, trusting that you're the only person in this relationship. So other people can have their voices, be very harsh or critical or protective, but it's really you that is deciding your life.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
What are the sets of shoulds and should nots that you're checking in on when things are happening in this relationship? And where did those statements come from? Are these shoulds based on what I saw in romantic movies growing up? Are they based on my parents' relationships, my friends' relationships? Or is this something that is coming from what I actually want and need in this relationship? I think in every session, if a should comes up, I'm like, where did that should come from? That felt really, really pointed there. And oftentimes when we look at those statements that we make all the time, every day, when we really pull them apart, they shatter into a million pieces. We're like, oh, I have that also doesn't align with who I am or how I am in relationships.
This has been so fun. We should do this again.
So to be continued, guys. We'll just have this roundtable discussion regularly. And this has been great.
See you later.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.